input into 3 independent components, and because we have a clear separation of the business logic, the presentation logic and the data which the application manipulates, it is easier for us to go ahead and build certain automated tests on either the domain or the presentation or the business logic. Therefore, you are reducing the amount of code which is directly tied on to the user interface. So it's trying to create a modularization within your application, and because of this modularization, you are having a clear segregation of each component doing a specific activity, thereby allowing us to perform automated tests very, very easily on these multiple components. So that's what the pattern lists down, saying whenever I'm creating applications, can I go ahead and modularize and create sub-components within my application such that we have different components handling the business logic part, a different component which handles your presentation logic, and another component which would take care of your data. So we would have model components, we would have view components, and we would have controller components. Now this kind of a categorization one would need to do probably at an architecting level or also at a programming level. Therefore, we call it as both an architectural pattern as well as a design pattern. Now, when we look at MVC pattern, there are 3 major components that I need to identify within my applications, and these 3 major components are your model component, your view component, and your controller component. The model component is required to manage data and behavior of your application. It would respond to requests for information about its state. Because it is storing data, it has to make sure that whenever there is a request for business data, it should be able to provide that updated business data. It should be able to give information about this business data. And every time there are changes to your business data, it should be able to respond to the instructions to change that state. So these things also need to be handled by your model component. The next component that we would have to develop as part of our application is our view component, wherein the view is the component that handles display of information. So it is just a simple user interface screen that I need to go ahead and design. No business logic, no data that I will need to be making the view available of. When I develop and build up my view components, I should try and ensure that in the view component, I am only designing my user interface. And this particular user interface in turn will interact with model and controllers to go ahead and display your business data. So the presentation aspect of your entire application is what the view component goes ahead and manages. The third component that we have as part of the MVC architecture is the controller component, wherein the controller component interprets the mouse and keyboard inputs from the user, and based on these mouse and keyboard inputs from the user based on the URL requests that user makes. It informs the model and or the view to change as appropriate. So controller component is like a driving unit of what should happen based on user events, based on mouse movements, based on keyboard inputs, based on requests from an end user. How should it go ahead and respond back to the user after getting in touch with the view and the model components? So controller is the central component that we would have to create as part of a MVC architecture. So in an overall scenario, we would go ahead and try and identify three components. Identify components which hold business data as model part. Identify those components that handle the presentation aspect of your application as the view components. And that particular component that drives your entire business logic is what we would go ahead and identify as our controller component. And that is the whole MVC pattern all about. Whenever we are going ahead and designing our applications, let us go ahead and create an application that tries to follow a MVC pattern. Now when we are going for the MVC pattern usage, why should I actually go ahead and adopt MVC pattern? What are the advantages that a MVC pattern implementation would give to my application? Let us see that. What is the need for MVC? The reason why we go for a MVC representation is because you have divided your application into three discrete components where each component is a self-contained unit in itself. You are able to easily manage the complexity of your applications. Rather than having all of the components, whether it is data manipulation, whether it is business logic, whether it is presentation, instead of having everything as part of a single application, you are trying to divide your application into certain components such that you are trying to create a modularization. And because you have created modularization,